This video will discuss Chapter 1, Section 3, Distance and Midpoint. Distance and midpoint are both formulas that are chosen depending on the information that is given. So before we graphed points on the coordinate plane. Now we're going to be finding the distance between two of those points and finding the midpoints of those segments. The vocabulary that you're going to be focusing on to make sure that you understand is distance, midpoint, and segment bisector. The first concept that we are going to discuss is the distance formula on a number line. The distance between 2 points is the absolute value of the difference between their coordinates. If P has coordinate x1 and Q has coordinate x2, then PQ equals the absolute value of x2 minus x1 or x1 minus x2. That's all very confusing. Basically, what you want to focus on is the fact that the number farthest to the right is the big number. So you're going to be taking the bigger number minus the smaller number. The number that's farthest to the right minus the number that is farthest to the left. So here is an example of how to find the distance on a number line. So I take the number again that is farthest to the right. In this case, that would be the R. And R is -3. So I take -3 and I subtract -6. These both become positive, and 6 minus 3 is 3. Here is an example that you should try. The correct answer is 8 because you take 3 and subtract -5. These both become positive and you get 8. Here is the distance formula in the coordinate plane. If P has coordinates x1 and y1 and Q has coordinates x2 and y2, then the distance between those points is the square root of the quantity x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. What you are doing is finding the difference in the x's and squaring it, and the difference in the y's and squaring it. Here is how it would work. Find the distance between point E, -4, 1, and F, 3, -1. So the first thing I'm going to do is write the distance formula, which I would highly suggest you memorize because it will not be given to you on a test or a quiz. Distance is equal to the square root of parentheses x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. So now I'm going to substitute. And x2 simply means the second point, so I take my x here and is my 3, and I take my -4, and that substitutes into here. y2 is the y of the second point, which is this -1, and y1 becomes the y of the first point, which goes here. Notice that this is a minus sign because that is the formula. If you need to, feel free to write above each point x1, y1, and I apologize for my penmanship here, x2, y2, if that will help you keep track. 3 plus 4 becomes 7 squared, and -1 minus 1 becomes -2 because this becomes plus a negative, and you get -2 squared. When you simplify, 7 squared becomes 49, -2 squared becomes 4, and you get the square root of 53. You may leave it as the square root of 53. You do not need to simplify it into a decimal at this point. Here is an example for you to try. If you are going to do this problem, you would substitute it in. x2 is 1. x1 is -3, and then you square that, plus 2 minus 4 squared. This gives you 4 squared plus -2 squared all underneath the radical still, which gives you the square root of 16 plus 4, which simplifies to the square root of 20, or C. The previous two examples were of distance. Distance is always positive because it doesn't matter if you're going forwards or backwards. Midpoint, however, is a location on a number line. Midpoint is in the middle. So it's also another word for midpoint would be the average. If AB has endpoints x1 and x2 on a number line, then the midpoint is achieved by adding the x's and dividing by 2, because that gives you the middle. If you have the midpoint formula on a coordinate plane, because you are dealing with x's and y's, you have to find the middle of the x's and then the middle of the y's. That is all this fancy picture is showing you. x1, y1, x2, y2. Here is the midpoint of the x's, and here is the midpoint of the y. If you can remember that midpoint you add and divide by 2, and distance you subtract the biggest from the smallest. Here is an example of finding the midpoint on the coordinate plane. My points are G is 8, negative 6, and H is negative 14, 12. So I'm going to say that G is going to be my x1, y1, and H is going to be my x2, y2. And again, feel free to write this on top of the points. x1, y1, x2, y2. Now I'm going to substitute. 8 for x1, negative 14 for x2, and I divide it by 2 because that is the formula. Negative 6 is y1, 12 is y2, and it's divided by 2 because that is the formula. 8 plus a negative 14 is negative 6, divided by 2. Negative 6 plus 12 is positive 6, divided by 2. And my point in the middle, my midpoint, is negative 3, 3. Again, please note that I can have a negative number because this negative just refers to a location. It is not a distance. Here is an example for you to solve. So in this example, I am given the midpoint because it says find the coordinates of D if E, negative 6, 4 is the midpoint of DF and F has coordinates negative 5, negative 3. I like to draw a picture to help me here. And I know that my first point is D and my last point is F. And I know that E is the midpoint because that's what the given information is. I know that this is negative 6 and 4, and F is negative 5, negative 3. And I want to know what the X and the Y are for D. I can find my answer by comparing my X's. I went from negative 6 to negative 5. That means that I added 1. If I add 1 going to the right, I'm going to subtract 1 going to the left. So therefore, negative 6 minus 1 means that X is negative 7. I'm going to compare the distance from 4 to negative 3. I start with the number that is to the right. So from negative 3 minus 4, I went down 7 spaces. So if I'm going to go down 7 spaces to the right, I'm going to go up 7 spaces to the left because I am doing the opposite to go from here to here. It's like saying I'm going to one friend's house, lives the same distance from the other friend. And therefore, 7 plus 4 gives me 11, and therefore my point, my answer is negative 7, 11. Here is an example for you to try. Here's my final example. I can use algebra to find missing measurements. What is the measure of segment PR if Q is the midpoint of PR? Well, if Q is the midpoint, remember that means that it is the same from QR to PQ. This would be 6 minus 3x. And if we did in the previous problem, I know that two parts make up a whole. So I would take 6 minus 3x plus 6 minus 3x, and I'm going to set it equal to 14x plus 2. And I greatly apologize for my penmanship. I am working on improving that as well by getting even more new technology. To solve this, I combine like terms, and 6 plus 6 is 12, and negative 3x and negative 3x gives me negative 6x. 14x plus 2 does not change. I am going to add 6x and get 20x. And I'm going to subtract 2 and get 10. And then I am going to divide 20 by both sides, and I get that 1/2 is equal to x. You can leave it as 0.5. You can also leave it as the fraction 1/2. But the question asks me, what is the measure of PR if Q is the midpoint? It's not asking me to find x. So while I have to find x as a stepping stone, I then have to substitute into PR. So 14 times 1/2 plus 2. Half of 14 is 7, and 7 plus 2 gives me 9. So 9 is equal to the length of PR. Here is an example for you to try. Please bring any questions or concerns you have to class. Feel free to send me an email or use Remind before you get there. I would like to apologize for the penmanship in this video. I am waiting for my iOS update so that I can use my new technology more efficiently.